In the spring of 1943, high above the endless blue of the Coral Sea, an American bomber moved through the sky so alone that even the ocean beneath it seemed indifferent to its fate, a single B-17 Flying Fortress cutting a slow, steady path through enemy-controlled airspace where survival depended not on bravery, but on timing, altitude, and luck, three things this aircraft was rapidly running out of. The Pacific War had entered a brutal phase, one where every mile of air was contested and every mission felt like a gamble against death itself, and nowhere was this more true than near the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul, a fortress bristling with radar stations, anti-aircraft guns, and squadrons of elite fighter pilots who had already sent countless Allied planes spiraling into the sea. The bomber's crew knew the statistics: lone aircraft did not return from these skies, especially not slow, heavy bombers designed to survive only when flying in tight formations, protected by overlapping defensive fire. Yet this B-17 was flying alone, deliberately isolated, carrying out a reconnaissance mission so dangerous that few commanders would have volunteered for it, and fewer pilots would have accepted it. At the controls sat Captain Zeamer Jr., a man who did not fit the image of a wartime hero, an MIT-trained engineer whose calm demeanor and analytical mind had earned him a reputation among fellow pilots as a bookworm rather than a warrior, someone who trusted equations more than instinct and preparation more than bravado. Before the war, Zeamer had studied engineering, learning how systems behaved under stress, how forces interacted, and how small changes could produce enormous effects, and while others learned to fly by feel, Zeamer learned to fly by understanding why an aircraft behaved the way it did, a mindset that would soon place him in the most impossible situation of his life. This mission was not meant to be heroic, it was meant to be informative, a deep reconnaissance flight to gather intelligence on Japanese positions around Rabaul, and the risk was accepted because intelligence was as valuable as bombs. Sometimes even more so. The aircraft itself, nicknamed Old 666, was unlike any standard flying fortress, because Zeamer had personally overseen its modification, stripping unnecessary weight, reinforcing key sections, and most importantly, adding more guns than doctrine allowed, transforming the bomber into something closer to a flying porcupine than a reconnaissance plane. Where most B-17s carried around a dozen defensive weapons, Old 666 carried nearly twice that number, with overlapping fields of fire designed not by tradition, but by geometry, angles, and probability, because Zeamer understood a simple truth: if he could not outrun fighters, and could not outclimb them, then he would have to outthink them. Inside the aircraft, his crew, while handpicked for their discipline and marksmanship, moved with quiet efficiency, each man knowing his station, each aware that this mission would offer no second chances, no fighter escort, and no rescue if they went down. The sky was deceptively peaceful, sunlight reflecting off the wings, engines humming steadily, but calm in wartime skies often meant danger was already on the way. Japanese radar operators detected the lone aircraft long before it reached its objective, and to them it looked like a mistake, a solitary bomber wandering into a hornet's nest, an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Orders were given, engines roared to life, and 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters lifted into the air, piloted by men who had spent years mastering aerial combat, pilots who trusted speed, agility, and aggression, flying aircraft that had already earned a fearsome reputation across the Pacific. The Zero was everything the B-17 was: not a lightweight, fast, incredibly maneuverable, capable of climbing and turning in ways bombers could only dream of, and when flown by experienced pilots, it was a predator designed to hunt lumbering aircraft like flying fortresses. Inside Old 666, the first signs of trouble appeared as distant specks against the bright sky, barely visible at first, then slowly growing larger, sharper, unmistakable. The crew did not panic. They had expected this moment from the instant they crossed into hostile airspace, yet expectation did little to dull the reality of what was coming. 6 fighters against 1 bomber was not a battle, it was an execution. The gunners checked their weapons, the navigator confirmed their position, the radio operator listened in vain for friendly signals that would never come, and Captain Zeamer remained silent, eyes scanning the sky, mind already racing ahead of the unfolding crisis. Conventional wisdom dictated only one response: maintain speed, maintain altitude, try to escape, because slowing down meant death, and maneuvering meant exposing blind spots that enemy fighters would exploit without mercy. Every pilot knew this rule, and every Zero pilot relied on it, expecting bombers to behave predictably, to react the way training manuals said they should. But Zeamer was not thinking about manuals, he was thinking about vectors, relative motion, and firing geometry, about how speed affected closure rates, and how angles determined whether a gunner had half a second or 3 full seconds to fire. As the Zeros closed in, forming their attack patterns, Zeamer realized that if he played by their rules, he would lose in seconds, because no amount of courage could make a bomber faster or more agile than a fighter. Instead, he began to consider the one option no one else would dare to try, an option that went against every instinct drilled into pilots since the beginning of air combat. The Japanese fighters expected him to run, to maintain speed, to present predictable attack angles. But what if he didn't? What if, instead of trying to escape, he reshaped the battle entirely? The decision was not made in panic, it was made in calculation, in a split-second mental equation balancing risk against inevitability, because Zeamer understood that doing the expected guaranteed defeat, while doing the unthinkable at least created a chance. As the Zeros prepared their attack, confident in their superiority, Captain Zeamer Jr. made the choice that would define the rest of his life. A choice so counterintuitive that even his own crew would struggle to understand it in the moment, a choice that would turn the laws of physics into a weapon and transform a doomed reconnaissance flight into one of the most extraordinary air battles of World War II. The moment Captain Zeamer Jr. made his decision, the rules of the sky changed, because instead of pushing the throttles forward and trying to outrun aircraft that were built to be faster than him, he did something that felt completely wrong to every instinct a pilot possessed. He eased the bomber's speed back, not dramatically, not suddenly, but just enough to alter the invisible mathematics of the fight unfolding around him. To the Japanese Zero pilots, this made no sense, because bombers always tried to maintain speed, always tried to stretch distance, always tried to delay the moment when fighters could close in and fire, and yet this lone B-17 was doing the opposite, hanging in the air like bait, forcing the attackers to rethink their approach even if only subconsciously. What Zeamer understood, and what the Zero pilots did not yet realize, was that speed was not just an advantage, it was also a limitation, because the faster a fighter closed in on a target, the less time its pilot had to aim, adjust, and fire accurately, and by slowing down, Zeamer was lengthening the engagement window for his gunners while shrinking it for the attackers. As the first Zero dove in, expecting the usual fleeting firing opportunity, it suddenly found itself rushing too fast, overshooting its ideal angle, streaking through a storm of tracer fire that seemed far denser than anticipated, because Old 666 was no ordinary bomber. It was a carefully engineered trap. The gunners, trained to exploit longer firing windows, opened up in coordinated arcs, bullets converging through overlapping fields of fire, and in that extended fraction of a second, the impossible happened. The Zero took hits, its wing spar shattered, and the fighter broke apart in midair, falling toward the sea below before its pilot could even react. The remaining Japanese pilots were shocked, not frightened yet, but confused, because bombers were not supposed to kill fighters so quickly, and certainly not on the first pass. Adjusting tactics, they regrouped and attacked again, this time from multiple angles, diving and climbing, trying to overwhelm the bombers' defenses, but every time they closed in, they found themselves trapped in a geometry they did not expect, because Zeamer's reduced speed forced them to fly tighter, closer, and longer within the bombers' defensive envelope, turning their greatest strengths as speed and agility into liabilities. Inside Old 666, the air filled with noise and chaos, machine guns hammering, spent casings clattering across the floor, the sharp smell of cordite mixing with oil and sweat, as the crew fought with a calm born not of confidence, but of necessity, because panic would only waste the precious seconds Zeamer had created for them. 1-0 came in from the rear, lining up for what should have been a textbook kill, only to be met by a wall of fire from the tail guns and upper turret, bullets tearing through its fuselage, igniting fuel, and sending it spinning away in flames. A second enemy destroyed not by brute force, but by positioning. The Japanese pilots began to realize that this was no ordinary bomber crew, but realization did not equal retreat, because honor, training, and confidence pushed them forward, and the attacks continued, faster and more aggressive, cannon shells tearing into old 666's skin, ripping through aluminum, severing control cables, shattering plexiglass, and wounding men inside. A burst of fire tore into the cockpit, shrapnel slashing across Zeamer's face and body, knocking him back against his seat, blood filling his eyes. But even wounded, he refused to relinquish control, because the aircraft itself was now the weapon, and any loss of precision would collapse the delicate balance he had created. The co-pilot, wounded as well, struggled to assist, while the navigator and radio operator were hit in their stations, yet the guns kept firing, because Zeamer's modifications meant that even damaged positions could be covered by overlapping arcs from elsewhere on the aircraft. Another Zero attacked head-on, believing speed would save it, but the forward-firing guns Zeamer had insisted on installing came alive, tearing into the fighter's engine, and in a flash of smoke and metal, a third enemy aircraft vanished from the fight. At this point, the sky around Old 666 was littered with debris, smoke trails, and falling wreckage, a visual contradiction of everything air combat doctrine predicted, because a single bomber was not supposed to dominate the airspace around it. The remaining Zeros became more cautious, circling, probing, trying to find blind spots that did not exist, because Zeamer had designed the aircraft specifically to eliminate predictable weaknesses, and every second they hesitated only increased the bomber's chances. Inside the aircraft, the situation was dire. Fires burned in multiple compartments, control surfaces were partially disabled, oxygen lines were severed, and wounded men fought to stay conscious. Yet the aircraft remained controllable, and more importantly, it remained lethal. Another Zero made a diving attack from above, but in doing so, it exposed itself to converging fire from the top turret and waist guns, the extended firing window once again proving fatal, as bullets ripped through its wings, snapping it apart, marking the fourth Japanese fighter destroyed. By now, the surviving pilots understood they were facing something unprecedented, a bomber flown not as a target, but as a system designed to manipulate their behavior, forcing them into fatal decisions they would never have made against a conventional aircraft. Still, they pressed on, driven by the belief that sheer persistence would eventually overwhelm the bomber, and in one final coordinated assault, they struck again, damaging engines, shredding control lines, and inflicting even more casualties on the crew, leaving Old 666 barely holding together. Captain Zeamer, now severely wounded, could barely see, yet he maintained control through muscle memory and instinct reinforced by years of engineering thought, understanding how the aircraft would respond even when its systems were failing. In the end, the cost to the Japanese was too high, because of the 6 Zeros that had risen to destroy a lone bomber, only to remain capable of flight, and even they were damaged, low on ammunition, and shaken by losses they could not explain through conventional logic. The surviving fighters disengaged, circling once more before turning away, leaving the battered B-17 alone in the sky, victorious not in the traditional sense, but alive, which in war often meant the same thing. Inside Old 666, silence replaced gunfire, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the uneven rhythm of damaged engines, as the crew realized, slowly and incredulously, that they had survived an encounter that should have annihilated them. Yet survival was only half the battle, because the aircraft was still deep in enemy territory, crippled, leaking fuel, and barely controllable, and Captain Zeamer Jr., bleeding and exhausted, now faced the final test of his extraordinary gamble, getting his crew home alive. When the last Japanese Zero disappeared into the distance, leaving only smoke, wreckage, and silence behind, the victory felt unreal, because the sky around Old 666 no longer roared with gunfire, yet inside the battered bomber the fight was far from over, as the aircraft itself was barely alive, wounded almost beyond recognition, riddled with holes, leaking fuel, and carrying a crew whose condition mirrored the machine they depended on. Captain Zeamer Jr. was severely injured, his body cut by shrapnel, blood soaking into his flight suit, his vision blurred, and yet his hands remained locked on the controls, because letting go even for a moment could mean losing what little stability the aircraft still possessed, and in that fragile balance between flight and collapse, every small correction mattered more than ever. Around him, crewmen lay wounded at their stations, some unconscious, some barely able to move, yet those who could still function continued to work, because war had taught them that survival was not decided by comfort, but by stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstance. The engines, damaged but still running, vibrated unevenly, each sound a reminder that mechanical failure could strike at any second, and with no escort, no friendly fighters, and miles of hostile ocean beneath them, there would be no rescue if the aircraft went down. Zeamer knew this, and yet he pressed on, navigating by instinct, memory, and whatever instruments still functioned, guiding old 666 away from the enemy and toward the distant hope of Allied territory. Every mile felt longer than the last, because the adrenaline that had sustained them during the fight was fading, replaced by pain, exhaustion, and the creeping awareness of how close they had come to annihilation. Fires had been extinguished, but the damage remained. Control cables were partially severed, structural integrity compromised, and fuel levels uncertain, turning the flight home into a slow, agonizing test of endurance rather than skill. At one point, an engine threatened to fail completely, forcing Zeamer to adjust power settings carefully, balancing thrust and drag in a way only someone deeply familiar with the aircraft's physics could manage, because sudden changes could tear the damaged airframe apart. The crew worked together in near silence, communicating with brief gestures and strained voices, each man aware that their lives depended not just on the pilot, but on collective discipline, on doing their part even when wounded, because chaos now would undo everything they had survived. Eventually, after hours that felt like days, the outline of friendly territory appeared on the horizon, a sight so emotional that some crewmen wept openly, not out of joy, but out of the release of tension they had carried since the moment the Zeros first appeared in the sky. Landing the aircraft was the final and most dangerous challenge, because old 666 was no longer a stable bomber, and any misjudgment during descent could cause catastrophic failure. Yet Zeamer approached it with the same calculated calm that had defined his decisions in combat, understanding how damaged control surfaces would respond at lower speeds and compensating with subtle, deliberate inputs. When the bomber finally touched down, rolling to a halt in a cloud of dust and smoke, the moment marked not just the end of a mission, but the conclusion of one of the most extraordinary aerial engagements in the history of warfare. Medical crews rushed forward, pulling wounded men from the aircraft, treating injuries that ranged from shrapnel wounds to severe blood loss, and it was only then, once the engines fell silent, that Zeamer allowed himself to be carried from the cockpit, his body finally acknowledging the pain he had suppressed for so long. News of the battle spread quickly, first through whispered accounts among aircrews, then through official reports that struggled to explain how a single bomber had destroyed multiple enemy fighters and returned home alive, because the outcome defied conventional understanding of air combat. Investigations confirmed the impossible. Old 666 had been attacked by 6 Japanese Zeros, had destroyed at least 5 of them, and had survived through a combination of preparation, discipline, and an unprecedented tactical decision that rewrote expectations of bomber defense. Captain Zeamer Jr. and his crew became symbols not of reckless heroism, but of intelligent courage, of the idea that knowledge and preparation could rival even the most skilled opponents when applied at the right moment. Zeamer himself would later receive the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration, not for a single act of bravery, but for sustained leadership, innovation, and self-sacrifice under extreme conditions, as he continued to fly and fight despite severe wounds, refusing to abandon his crew or his aircraft. Other crew members received high honors as well, recognizing that survival had been a collective achievement, not the result of one man alone, because every gunner who held his position, every wounded airman who continued to function, had contributed to the outcome. Yet beyond medals and citations, the legacy of that day lay in its lesson, because Zeamer's decision to slow down challenged one of the most deeply held assumptions in air combat, proving that speed was not always an advantage, and that understanding the physics of engagement could transform vulnerability into strength. Military analysts studied the battle, recognizing how altering closure rates and engagement geometry could change the dynamics of fighter versus bomber encounters, and while the exact circumstances were rare, the principle endured. Innovation often emerges not from doing more, but from doing something different. In the years after the war, Zeamer Jr. would fade from public attention, his story overshadowed by larger battles and more conventional heroes. Yet among aviators and historians, his name remained associated with one of the most improbable survivals in aerial warfare. His actions stood as a reminder that heroism is not always loud, that courage can be quiet, calculated, and deeply intellectual, and that sometimes, in the most desperate moments, the winning move is not to fight harder or faster, but to think differently. Over the Coral Sea in 1943, a bomber slowed down when every rule said it should speed up, and in that single, counterintuitive decision, physics became a weapon, intellect became armor, and a man once dismissed as a bookworm proved that knowledge, when combined with resolve, could bend even the brutal logic of war towards survival.